May 28, 1940. Reich Air Ministry, Berlin. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring set down the intelligence report with visible contempt. The document detailed President Franklin D. Roosevelt's appeal to Congress for an unprecedented expansion of American aircraft production, a capacity to manufacture 50,000 planes each year. Göring sneered. "The Americans are desperate if they believe such propaganda will frighten us," he said coldly to his staff. "They know nothing of war production. Let them try to convert their automobile factories. They will soon discover that building warplanes requires more than assembly lines." His officers nodded, confident in the superiority of German industry and the Luftwaffe's unmatched production capabilities. What Göring failed to understand was that across the Atlantic, the transformation had already begun. In Washington, President Roosevelt had appointed William S. Knudsen, a Danish-born former president of General Motors, as his chief of industrial production. Knudsen, now working for $1 a year, had been tasked with a single mission: to mobilize America's industrial power for war. Knudsen knew that America's strength lay not in existing weapons or factories, but in its ability to organize and produce on a scale no other nation could match. He began coordinating with major manufacturers: Ford, Chrysler, Douglas, Boeing, and hundreds of smaller suppliers, to standardize production, expand capacity, and shift civilian industries toward military output. Automobile assembly lines were redesigned to build aircraft engines and fuselages. Consumer goods plants began turning out instruments, radios, and precision parts for bombers and fighters. As Göring mocked Berlin, Knudsen quietly set in motion an industrial chain reaction. Machine tools multiplied, new factories rose from empty fields, and workers poured into production centers across the country. America's economy, once centered on consumer goods, was rapidly transforming into the world's most powerful war machine. By the end of 1943, Roosevelt's ambitious target of 50,000 planes a year was not only met, but exceeded. American factories were producing nearly 100,000 aircraft annually, bombers, fighters, and transports, delivered to every front across 2 vast oceans. The same system Göring dismissed as assembly line propaganda had become the decisive factor of the war. What Göring had read with disdain that May morning would, within 4 years, mark the beginning of Germany's downfall. The United States, once viewed as industrially naive, had mastered the art of total production, and in doing so, reshaped the course of modern warfare. The declaration that drew German contempt came on May 16, 1940, as German panzers thundered through the open fields of France, crushing resistance with terrifying speed. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before Congress and issued a challenge that seemed almost fantastical. "I would like to see this nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year." His words echoed through the chamber and across the Atlantic. Even America's allies were stunned. To many, Roosevelt's demand sounded like political theater, not a feasible plan. In 1939, the United States had produced only 3,611 military aircraft in total. The Army Air Corps, the air arm of the U.S. Army, had just 1,700 combat-ready planes, many of them slow, lightly armed, and already outdated. The President was asking for a 14-fold increase in production at a time when the country still lacked the industrial infrastructure, technical expertise, and manpower for large-scale war manufacturing. But Roosevelt knew where to turn. The key was William S. Knudsen, a Danish-born industrial genius who had risen from a mechanic's bench to the presidency of General Motors. When presidential advisor Bernard Baruch was asked who could possibly accomplish such a transformation, his answer was simple. First, Bill Knudsen. Second, Bill Knudsen. Third, Bill Knudsen. Knudsen left behind his $300,000 salary, a fortune in its time, to serve the United States for $1 a year. He brought with him a mastery of mass production, standardization, and logistical efficiency, the very principles that had built America's automobile empire. Where bureaucrats saw limits, Knudsen saw untapped potential. He understood that America's strength was not in centralized control, but in the vast decentralized power of private industry. Immediately, he began coordinating manufacturers, engineers, and labor unions. Automobile plants that once built Buicks and Chevrolets were retooled for engines, wings, and fuselages. Refrigerator companies began producing aircraft instruments. Typewriter manufacturers switched to precision gun parts. The conversion from civilian to military production was total, and it was rapid. By December 1941, on the eve of America's entry into the war, the results were undeniable. U.S. factories were rolling out over 2,000 military aircraft per month, a 20-fold increase in just 2 years. The Ford Motor Company, driven by Henry Ford's ambition and Knudsen's direction, announced the construction of the Willow Run bomber plant in Michigan, the largest factory in the world. Boeing's Seattle facilities doubled in size to meet the surging demand for bombers, while Douglas Aircraft expanded its workforce by the thousands. The sleeping industrial giant had awakened. Roosevelt's impossible challenge was no longer a dream. It was becoming reality. The arsenal of democracy was stirring to life, and its engines of production would soon drown out the sound of German confidence. The Nazi leadership's contempt for American capability was rooted in arrogance and ideological blindness. They saw the United States not as a rising industrial power, but as a soft, materialistic society, incapable of endurance, discipline, or sacrifice. Among the few who understood otherwise was General Friedrich von Beuteker, Germany's military attaché in Washington from 1933 to 1941. Unlike many in Berlin, Beuteker carefully observed America's growing industrial mobilization and sent detailed reports warning of its potential. In December 1940, his dispatch to the German High Command carried a clear and urgent message. American war production will reach unimaginable heights. He described the rapid expansion of factories, the mobilization of resources, and the coordination between government and industry that was already reshaping the U.S. economy for war. But his warnings found no audience in Berlin. To the Nazi hierarchy, especially the senior officers within the Reich Air Ministry and the Wehrmacht, such assessments sounded like pessimism, an insult to German superiority. When Beuteker met with Hitler personally in February 1939 to discuss America's potential strength, the Führer dismissed him outright. Rather than engaging with the intelligence reports, Hitler launched into one of his ideological tirades, declaring that the United States was half Judaized, half negrified, and incapable of sustained warfare. He insisted that a nation so racially mixed could never maintain discipline or unity in a prolonged conflict. Facts were ignored, and racist dogma replaced rational analysis. This blindness became one of the Reich's most costly miscalculations. While Hitler mocked America as weak and divided, its industries were evolving into the most formidable production network the world had ever seen. By the time Germany realized the truth, that American factories could build in months what the Reich could not in years, it was far too late. The ideological arrogance that dismissed U.S. potential as degenerate would ultimately ensure Germany's defeat. The prejudice infected all levels of German command. Luftwaffe intelligence dismissed reports of women entering aircraft factories as signs of American desperation. They could not conceive that democratic mobilization might outperform totalitarian command. When reports arrived describing factories running 3 shifts a day, German analysts assumed exaggeration. The Nazi worldview could not accommodate the reality of American industry. That reality took form in Michigan. Ford's Willow Run plant, constructed on farmland beginning April 18, 1941, became the world's largest factory under one roof, 3.5 million square feet, with an assembly line stretching 1 mile long. Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief, promised to build 1 B-24 Liberator bomber per hour, when other factories managed 1 per day. The early results were catastrophic. The first bomber, completed in September 1942, had to be completely rebuilt. Quality control failures reached 50%. By February 1943, Willow Run produced just 56 bombers monthly against promises of hundreds. Critics mocked it as, "Will it run?" But Ford engineers persevered. They broke the B-24's 488,193 parts into manageable sub-assemblies. They developed hydraulic riveting tools, prefabricated wiring harnesses, and true moving assembly lines. They implemented 578 design changes in 1943 alone, while maintaining production. By September 1943, monthly production reached 148 bombers. By December, 365. The breakthrough came in April 1944, when Willow Run produced 428 B-24s, one every 63 minutes, operating 24 hours a day. This single factory was outproducing the entire German aviation industry. German pilots were the first to notice. During the Tunisia campaign, Major Johannes Steinhoff, commander of JG-77, observed in December 1942, "The American pilots are no longer amateurs. Most disturbing of all, there are more of them every day." The revelation deepened through 1943. On January 27th, the Americans launched their first raid on Germany itself. 64 bombers striking Wilhelmshaven. By October, during Black Thursday at Schweinfurt, they could lose 60 B-17s in 1 day and replace them within 2 weeks. Mathematics had become inescapable. During Big Week, February 20th to 25th, 1944, the 8th and 15th Air Forces mounted 3,500 bomber sorties against German aircraft production. The Luftwaffe lost between 262 and 355 fighters, but more crucially, about 100 irreplaceable veteran pilots. General Adolf Galland reported to Goering that Germany was losing 1,200 fighters monthly, while producing 1,000. America was producing 2,500 fighters monthly, while losing 400. Major Heinz Bahr, one of Germany's top aces with 220 victories, described a January 1944 mission over Brunswick. The bomber stream stretched from horizon to horizon. At least 700 flying fortresses and liberators. We were 8 fighters against hundreds. It was hopeless. By 1944, American aircraft production reached staggering proportions. That year alone, factories produced 96,270 aircraft, 16,048 heavy bombers, 35,743 fighters, and 22,591 multi-engine aircraft. In 1 year, the United States built more aircraft than Germany did during the entire war. The difference went beyond numbers. Each American bomber carried 13.50 caliber machine guns with thousands of rounds. German fighters increasingly launched with partial ammunition loads. American bombers featured powered turrets, advanced bomb sights, and sophisticated navigation systems. German fighters often lacked functioning radios. By May 1944, Boeing's Seattle Plant 2 was producing 16 B-17s per day. Douglas aircraft, which had employed just 68 people in 1936, now employed 167,000 across 9 facilities. North American Aviation produced 500 P-51 Mustangs monthly. Lockheed achieved production of 1 P-38 Lightning every 90 minutes, while implementing over 2,000 combat-driven modifications. Supporting industries matched this pace. General Motors built 57,658 aircraft engines under license. Packard produced 55,523 Rolls-Royce Merlins. Alcoa's aluminum output increased 600%. Dow Chemical's magnesium production rose from 6 million pounds annually to 333 million. The transformation of America's workforce destroyed every Nazi illusion. Women, who made up less than 1% of aircraft workers in 1941, represented 65% by 1943. Over 310,000 women in the aircraft industry. At Douglas Long Beach, 22,038 of 41,162 employees were women. Rose Will Monroe, the original Rosie the Riveter, drove 3,000 rivets per shift at Willow Run with 99.5% accuracy. Women inspectors at Douglas reduced defect rates from 3.2% to 0.3%. Ford redesigned tools for smaller hands, improving efficiency across the board. Lighter pneumatic tools reduced fatigue, while better workstations decreased injuries. German intelligence interpreted female employment as desperation. A captured Luftwaffe report dismissed these workers as temporary, predicting a collapse in quality. Instead, the opposite happened. Precision improved. Women excelled at detailed work, wiring, instrumentation, inspection. Their integration represented not weakness, but democratic strength. As American production soared, the Nazi leadership remained trapped in delusion. The very system they believed superior had already doomed them. The collapse of German industry began not with the Allied bombs that shattered its skylines, but with the arrogance that blinded its leaders. Hitler believed he could substitute ideology for mathematics. When his generals warned that Allied production dwarfed theirs 10-1, he dismissed them as defeatists. Quantity is no substitute for quality, he thundered. But even quality was slipping away, strangled by shortages, mismanagement, and fantasy. By 1943, German aircraft factories faced shortages of aluminum, copper, and synthetic rubber. The RAF and USAAF bombed Ruhr industrial centers relentlessly. The Allies targeted ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt, engine factories in Regensburg, and aircraft assembly lines in Bremen. Each attack forced the Germans deeper underground. In desperation, the Luftwaffe shifted production into tunnels, caves, and abandoned mines. At Mittelwerk, deep beneath the Kohnstein mountain, prisoners from Buchenwald labored in appalling conditions to build V-2 rockets. 12-hour shifts without sunlight, starvation rations, and disease claimed 20,000 lives, more than were killed by the V-2 in combat. Every missile that rose into the sky carried the shadow of the dead. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, introduced sweeping centralization to sustain production. He streamlined logistics, standardized parts, and extended working hours to near slavery. For a brief period in 1944, output appeared to rise. The monthly aircraft production peaked at 3,000 fighters in September. Hitler saw this as proof that willpower could overcome destruction. What he ignored was the mounting collapse beneath the surface. Lack of fuel, no pilots, and no raw materials. The Luftwaffe's training system imploded. In 1941, new pilots received 240 flight hours before combat. By 1944, they received barely 50. Engine shortages forced instructors to ration flight time. Aviation gasoline was so scarce that some planes were towed to runways by horses. Meanwhile, in America, every weakness the Germans suffered became a point of strength. The United States didn't merely produce machines, it built an ecosystem. Aluminum smelters ran on hydroelectric dams. Rubber plants in Texas synthesized Buna S. Tank and aircraft factories shared supply chains. The concept of interchangeable parts, pioneered by the auto industry, reached new levels of perfection. A B-24 wing panel made in Tulsa fit perfectly, with a fuselage assembled in Fort Worth. The American war machine was not a factory. It was a civilization of production. In Germany, Speer's efforts could only delay collapse. By mid-1944, Allied air superiority made transport almost impossible. Trains could not move freely. Coal shipments to steel mills dwindled. Skilled workers were dead or at the front. Slave labor filled the gap, but exhaustion, sabotage, and despair destroyed efficiency. Production lines could not function when bombs fell by day and night. The contrast was staggering. While Germany dispersed its production into caves, America expanded into open skies. The Boeing plant in Wichita, Kansas, became the largest producer of four-engine bombers on Earth. Inglewood, California, turned from citrus groves into concrete runways surrounded by Douglas factories. Lockheed's Burbank plant was camouflaged under a vast painted tarpaulin designed to look like a sleepy California suburb from the air. Underneath the fake trees and rooftops, 28,000 workers built the P-38 Lightning. Every detail of the American effort spoke of scale and precision. The Army Air Forces used punch cards to track every part number across thousands of subcontractors. Women in the War Production Board's office could locate the manufacturer of a specific bolt within minutes. Logistics wasn't an afterthought. It was the war itself. When Germany turned to its so-called miracle weapons, the contrast deepened further. The Me-262 jet fighter, capable of speeds above 500 miles per hour, should have revolutionized air combat. But Hitler's obsession with turning it into a bomber delayed its deployment for nearly a year. When it finally entered service in mid-1944, only a few hundred reached combat units, hampered by lack of fuel, spare parts, and trained pilots. In America, innovation worked in harmony with mass production. Radar, proximity fuses, and long-range fuel tanks were integrated into combat systems within weeks of development. The Mustang P-51, fitted with the British-designed Merlin engine, transformed the air war. For the first time, bombers could be escorted all the way to Berlin and back. American fighters now roamed at will over Germany, destroying aircraft on the ground before they ever took flight. By late 1944, Allied reconnaissance photos revealed a chilling pattern. German airfields lined with hundreds of unused aircraft. Not for lack of machines, but for lack of fuel. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, had become a ghost. Pilots were ordered to taxi planes to hidden fields, draining the last drops from communal tanks. Some squadrons received orders to conserve fuel by practicing gliding landings. The Allied bombing campaign intensified its focus. Oil refineries at Ploesti, synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, and rail networks across the Reich were systematically erased. The results were catastrophic. Germany's aviation gasoline production fell from 180,000 tons per month in May 1944 to less than 10,000 by January 1945. Without fuel, even the most advanced jet was a monument to futility. Inside the Führer bunker, reality never penetrated. Hitler still spoke of miracle turnarounds, of new jet squadrons that would sweep the skies. His generals knew better. They had seen the endless columns of American bombers, the endless supply of spare engines, the replacement of every loss within days. The war of attrition had become a war of arithmetic. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 29,355 heavy bombers. Germany built 1,131. The Luftwaffe shot down 4,300 Allied bombers that year. An impressive number until one compared it to production. America replaced every loss and added thousands more. Even the most loyal German officers began to understand. General Galland, after the war, reflected bitterly, "We were defeated not in the air, but in the factory." As the Reich crumbled, Speer toured the ruins of bombed plants, urging engineers to rebuild underground. In one tunnel complex near Ebensee, prisoners worked waist-deep in freezing water to construct machine tools. Speer knew it was madness, but lacked the courage to say it aloud. The system demanded illusions to survive one more week. Across the Atlantic, America was already preparing for the post-war world. Factories that had once built bombers were redesigning for peacetime. Ford engineers drafted plans to convert Willow Run for civilian aviation. Boeing engineers experimented with pressurized cabins for future passenger planes. America's war machine had not merely crushed an enemy, it had created the foundation of modern industry. But at that moment, in early 1945, the skies over Germany told the story most clearly. Each morning, tens of thousands of Allied aircraft took off from England, Italy, and France. B-17S, B-24S, and B-26S formed into vast armadas stretching from horizon to horizon. Fighters weaved above them in endless formations. Below, the German countryside burned. Entire cities vanished under firestorms. And yet, for all the horror, one fact stood immutable. This was the price of fascist delusion, the belief that arrogance could defy mathematics, that ideology could outproduce freedom. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an organized force. Of the 28,000 combat aircraft Germany had produced in the previous year, fewer than 1,200 remained operational. Fuel depots were empty, runways cratered, hangars destroyed. Pilots took off knowing they would never return. Some were boys of 16, barely trained, flying machines that could no longer climb or fight. And as the smoke thickened over the ruins of the Reich, a single truth echoed from the skies. The arsenal of democracy had spoken, and its language was production. Across the Pacific, a different kind of industrial war was being waged. The Japanese Empire had risen on the illusion that spirit could triumph over steel, that divine will and discipline could outmatch mass and machinery. But as with Hitler, ideology blinded them to reality. Japan's victories in 1941 and early 1942 came from preparation and surprise, not strength. Their aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor, their conquests across Southeast Asia, these were the last flashes of an empire already overreaching its capacity. Japan's industrial base was smaller than that of the state of New York. It produced barely 7 million tons of steel annually, compared to America's 90 million. Japan had no access to domestic oil, relied on shipping routes that stretched thousands of miles, and lacked the machine tools needed for sustained war production. The American response was swift, mathematical, and absolute. While Japan glorified sacrifice, the United States built an ocean of logistics. The shipyards were the first sign of this awakening. Henry J. Kaiser's yards on the West Coast transformed naval construction forever. In 1941, a Liberty ship required 244 days to build. By 1943, Kaiser's methods, modular sections, prefabricated components, round-the-clock shifts, cut that time to an astonishing 42 days. The record came with the SS Robert E. Peary, built in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. At the peak of production, American shipyards launched a vessel every 63 minutes. Japan could not replace what it lost. Each time an American submarine sank a freighter, the empire's arteries constricted. By 1944, Japan had lost more than half its merchant fleet. Oil from the Dutch East Indies could no longer reach its refineries. Aircraft sat idle for lack of fuel, tanks for lack of parts. Meanwhile, American industry turned naval warfare into science. The Essex-class aircraft carrier became the embodiment of industrial power, 880 feet long, carrying 90 aircraft, and mass-produced in quantities once thought impossible. 24 Essex carriers were launched during the war, each one a floating city of steel, radar, and aviation fuel. Supporting them were 122 escort carriers, 349 destroyers, and more than 3,000 landing ships. The Japanese could not even comprehend numbers like these. The contrast in production was staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, Japan built 15 fleet carriers. The United States built 122. Japan built 24 destroyers in 1944. America built 349. Japan launched 76 submarines. America launched 228. And while Japanese submarines hunted warships for glory, American submarines hunted freighters with ruthless precision, sinking over 55% of Japan's entire merchant marine. The power of American industry lay not only in output, but in replacement. Every loss was an opportunity to improve. When the USS Yorktown sank at Midway, shipyards were already constructing 3 replacements. When the Hornet went down at Santa Cruz, the Essex and Bunker Hill were fitting out in Newport News. The Japanese saw each ship as a sacred symbol. The Americans saw each ship as a product line. In the aircraft factories, the same logic applied. The Grumman plant in Bethpage, New York, became known as the Iron Works because its planes seemed indestructible. The F-6F Hellcat, designed in 1942, went from drawing board to combat in just 11 months. It was built with simplicity in mind, rugged, easy to repair, and designed for mass production. Over 12,000 Hellcats rolled off the line by 1945, and they destroyed 5,163 Japanese aircraft, more than any other Allied plane. On the West Coast, Boeing's Seattle assembly lines ran 24 hours a day. Workers streamed in under floodlights, building the B-17 and later the B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber of the war. Its pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, and 3 250-mile range represented the pinnacle of wartime engineering. At peak, the Wichita plant turned out 4 B-29 every day. Japan's aircraft industry could not compete. Its factories were fragmented, scattered across small workshops vulnerable to firebombing. Aluminum shortages forced the use of inferior metals. By 1944, Japan's aircraft quality declined sharply. Rivets popped, engines failed mid-flight, and mechanics lacked spare parts. The once feared Zero fighter, superior in 1941, was obsolete by 1943. Lightly built and underpowered, it faced American Hellcats and Corsairs that outclimbed, outdone, and outgunned it. The heart of Japan's industrial decline was oil. The United States had imposed an embargo in 1941, cutting off 80% of Japan's supply. The conquest of the Dutch East Indies temporarily solved this, but by 1943, American submarines and aircraft made oil transport suicidal. Refineries in Japan ran dry. Pilots trained in the air only once before combat. By late 1944, aircraft were towed to runways by oxen because gasoline was too precious to waste on taxiing. America's approach to logistics was the inverse of this desperation. At any given moment, the Pacific Fleet carried a moving city of supply. Floating dry docks, oilers, repair ships, and ammunition tenders turned the ocean itself into an extension of the American factory. A carrier damaged at Leyte Gulf could be repaired and returned to combat within weeks. Japan, by contrast, could not even deliver spare parts to its island garrisons. When Admiral Raymond Spruance launched the Mariana Campaign in June 1944, it marked the industrial tipping point of the Pacific War. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, known forever as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was the moment Japan's air arm ceased to exist. On June 19th, over 400 Japanese aircraft launched from carriers and island bases. Waiting for them were 450 American Hellcats, guided by radar, coordinated by radio, and directed by fleet controllers using real-time vector commands. The Japanese pilots, many with less than 100 flight hours, charged into the storm. Within minutes, the sky was filled with fire. 373 Japanese aircraft were destroyed that day. American losses, 29. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa wept as he learned his air groups were gone. He still had carriers, but they were now useless, floating runways without planes. Back in the United States, factories continued their relentless rhythm. The war economy had reached a state of perfect synchronization. In 1943, a report from the Office of War Mobilization noted that every 63 seconds, somewhere in America, a combat aircraft took flight for the first time. Every 5 minutes, a tank rolled off a line. Every 7 minutes, a ship was launched. Japan could not comprehend such scale. In desperation, its leaders turned to madness, the kamikaze. Planes stripped of landing gear, loaded with explosives, and flown by young men promised heaven for sacrifice. It was not strategy. It was despair given wings. Each kamikaze attack killed a handful of sailors, damaged ships, and achieved nothing lasting. For every American ship damaged, the factories replaced it. For every pilot lost, America trained 10 more. Japan's industrial collapse meant its death spiral was inevitable. By late 1944, American B-29s were taking off from the Mariana Islands. The skies over Tokyo glowed red at night. The superfortress bombers flew above 30,000 feet, beyond the reach of most Japanese fighters. When incendiary bombs replaced high explosives, entire cities vanished. On March 9th, 1945, the raid on Tokyo created a firestorm that killed 100,000 people in a single night, more than either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was the industrial system at its most terrible efficiency. 279 B-29s dropped 1,665 tons of napalm-filled bombs. Within 6 hours, 16 square miles of the city ceased to exist. Even as Japan burned, its leaders refused surrender. They believed that by inflicting enough casualties, they could negotiate. They still dreamed of a miracle. But in America's laboratories and factories, a different kind of miracle was taking shape. A weapon not of quantity, but of physics itself. In a cluster of facilities from Los Alamos to Oak Ridge, scientists and engineers, working under the Manhattan Project, had constructed the ultimate expression of industrial science. It was not merely a bomb. It was the condensation of the entire industrial age into a single flash of light. On August 6th, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian Island. 6 hours later, Hiroshima vanished. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. The war that began with the roar of Japanese aircraft over Pearl Harbor ended with silence over a ruined empire. And behind that silence stood the factories, the forges, the welders, the riveters, the machinists, and the assembly lines. The true engine of victory had never been in the battlefield. It was in Detroit, in Seattle, in Pittsburgh, in San Diego, in the hands of millions who never fired a shot, but who built the world that made victory inevitable. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world stood amid ruins, and one nation stood unmatched. The United States had not only won the war, it had reinvented the meaning of power itself. In Europe and Asia, factories lay in ashes, cities in rubble, populations broken. The United States, by contrast, had expanded. Its cities glowed at night with the lights of 24-hour production. Its railways and highways pulsed with movement. Its ports were choked with ships, its airfields with planes. In 4 years, America had produced 296,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 71,000 ships, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. It had built more vehicles than all the Axis powers combined. This industrial triumph was not an accident. It was the deliberate marriage of democracy and efficiency. When the war began, the United States had 132 million people. By 1945, 17 million had worked in defense plants, and 6 million of them were women. Productivity soared by 96%. Unemployment, once 25% during the Depression, fell to 1.2%. In a single decade, the nation had transformed from the world's greatest debtor to its greatest creditor. The rest of the world would now rebuild with American steel, American tools, and American loans. Europe's recovery began under the Marshall Plan, but its foundation had already been laid in wartime cooperation. American industry had learned to coordinate with allies across oceans, integrating supply chains, standardizing production, and managing logistics on a planetary scale. The habits of war became the architecture of peace. The same assembly lines that had built bombers now built cars. Ford's Willow Run plant converted from producing B-24 Liberators to producing automobiles once again, an act symbolic of a nation shifting from destruction to creation. The workers who had once riveted aluminum for warplanes now welded chrome for Cadillacs. But the knowledge remained, the precision, the systems thinking, the scale. The military-industrial complex was not dismantled. It evolved. The Cold War began before the ashes cooled. In 1946, President Truman signed the National Security Act. The Air Force became independent. The Central Intelligence Agency was born. The Pentagon, completed during the war as the world's largest office building, became the nerve center of a global system. Factories that had produced fighters and bombers now turned to jet aircraft. The B-47 Stratojet took flight in 1947, a swept-wing bomber built using lessons learned from captured German research and refined by American engineers. Within a decade, the B-52 would follow, still in service 70 years later. The same industrial machine that had defeated fascism now confronted communism. American shipyards built carriers not for conquest, but deterrence. Los Alamos, once shrouded in wartime secrecy, continued its work in the nuclear age. The production lines that once rolled out B-29S now turned to missiles. The mathematics of war had not vanished. It had gone global. But beneath this machinery of geopolitics lay something deeper. The war had permanently altered the American psyche. It had proven that free citizens, organized under purpose and discipline, could outproduce any tyranny on earth. It was the vindication of the democratic model, the belief that liberty, when united with labor, could outmatch fear. This confidence spilled into every field. Science, engineering, medicine, education, all absorbed the momentum of wartime organization. Research funding exploded. Universities became laboratories for innovation. In 1939, the United States had produced fewer than 100 PhDs in physics. By 1955, it produced more than 1,000 per year. The transformation of industry also reshaped culture. The mass production techniques perfected during the war now powered consumer abundance. Washing machines, refrigerators, and televisions rolled off the same lines that had built tanks. Assembly line discipline merged with peacetime prosperity, and yet this prosperity carried shadows. For the first time in history, the means of total destruction were mass-produced. The atomic bomb had shown that the same science which liberated could also annihilate. The tension between creation and destruction became the central paradox of the modern age. Still, in 1945, standing over the smoking ruins of the Axis empires, one fact was undeniable. Industrial democracy had triumphed over industrial dictatorship. In Germany, Albert Speer, now a prisoner, faced the reality he had long denied. At Nuremberg, he admitted, "The war was decided by the factories. I knew it. I saw it happening. The Americans could replace every loss, and we could not." The truth of Speer's words echoed in the data. For every German tank destroyed, America built 5. For every ship sunk, America launched 10. For every ton of bombs dropped by the Luftwaffe, the Allies dropped 50. But even beyond the numbers was the moral dimension. The free world had learned to harness organization without tyranny, coordination without chains. It had proven that efficiency and liberty were not enemies. As Europe rebuilt, American machinery, tractors, and trucks poured in. Former enemy nations, once crushed under bombs, now rebuilt under American assistance. Japan, whose cities had burned, found new life under the same industrial logic that had defeated it. American engineers helped rebuild its infrastructure. Its factories adopted American assembly techniques. Within a generation, Japan would become an industrial power in its own right. Proof that the tools of victory could also become the tools of renewal. The industrial age had reached its apex. For 6 years, every invention, every resource, every ounce of human will had been directed toward total war. Now, that same system stood ready to reshape peace. Radar evolved into commercial aviation. Jet propulsion became passenger flight. Rocketry led to space exploration. Synthetic materials created during the war, nylon, plastics, aluminum alloys, entered every home. But the lesson of the war remained etched in steel. The control of production was control of destiny. Factories had become battlefields. Logistics had become weapons. And information, radio, radar, communications, had become the new high ground. The nations that mastered these tools would shape the future, just as surely as armies once shaped the past. The soldiers returned home, but the systems they had built continued to march forward. The assembly lines never stopped. They simply changed their uniforms. In the 1950s, the term military-industrial complex would emerge, not as criticism alone, but as recognition of what had been born in those years. A vast, permanent fusion of science, industry, and strategy. The arsenal of democracy had become the foundation of the modern world. And yet behind every number, every machine, and every victory remained the human element. The welders, the machinists, the women on the night shifts, the immigrants who spoke little English but built the planes that crossed the Atlantic. They were the invisible army, the heartbeat of freedom's machine. The war had made them heroes not through battle, but through work. It had proven that in the age of total war, production itself was power. The war ended, but the machine did not. The factories that once roared for victory still pulsed with motion. The smokestacks still exhaled. The gears still turned. The men returned home, medals pinned to chests, hope in their eyes. But the world they stepped into was not the one they had left. The United States stood alone, untouched, unbroken, and transformed. While Europe smoldered in ruins and Asia rebuilt from ashes, America's cities glowed with light. Its highways stretched farther. Its industries roared louder. The nation that had armed the world now found itself the arsenal of peace. But peace had its own hunger. The machine that built tanks could not simply stop. The assembly lines demanded work. The workers demanded purpose. The investors demanded profit. So the machine found new shapes for its ambition. It built cars, televisions, refrigerators. It learned to sell comfort instead of courage. What began as an arsenal became an empire of production. The military discipline of wartime industry became the operating system of civilian life. Efficiency was no longer just a strategy. It was a religion. The stopwatch replaced the sermon. The assembly line replaced the cathedral. And yet, the rhythm was the same. The same hum, the same precision, the same logic. Build faster, build better, build more. The war had proven that the nation that builds the most wins. So America kept building. In 1947, the world split again. Not into armies, but into ideologies. The Cold War began quietly, in the static between radio frequencies. This time there were no trenches, no beaches, no armadas. The new front was invisible. Power grids, airwaves, laboratories, code. The United States and the Soviet Union were two mirrors staring at each other, each reflecting the same hunger. Control through production. The Soviets built their 5-year plans. America built its corporations. The Soviets built missiles. America built markets. Both built machines that could outlive their makers. The new war was fought not for land, but for speed. Speed of invention, speed of calculation, speed of destruction. The atom bomb had proven that power could be compressed into a formula. The transistor proved it could be miniaturized into a fingertip. One changed the world, the other digitized it. The scientists of Los Alamos did not go home. They did not return to quiet lives or peacetime research. Instead, they went underground, into laboratories buried in deserts, mountains, and remote facilities shielded by secrecy. The war had ended, but their work had not. Men who once calculated critical mass and chain reactions now calculated thrust, velocity, and orbital trajectories. The same equations that had destroyed cities were now repurposed to explore the heavens. The physics of annihilation had become the physics of aspiration. In October 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1. A polished metal sphere, no larger than a beach ball, rose from the steppes of Kazakhstan and slipped into orbit. Its signal, a simple rhythmic beep, echoed through radios around the world. Yet its meaning was anything but simple. To the United States, it was not just a satellite, it was a message. We can reach you. The impact was immediate and electric. Panic spread through Washington. Newspapers blared headlines of technological humiliation. Senators demanded answers. The American public, once confident in their nation's scientific supremacy, felt a sudden chill of vulnerability. The same government that had built the atomic bomb now feared it was falling behind in the new frontier of space. And with it, control over the weapons of the future. The response came swiftly. Within a year, the United States established NASA to pursue the peaceful conquest of space, and, alongside it, ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, created for the other side of the equation. ARPA was not born from curiosity, but from fear. Fear of technological surprise, fear of losing the race for control of information, missiles, and machines. Its mission was clear: ensure that the United States would never again be caught unprepared. From that mandate came innovations no one could have predicted. In its pursuit of survivable communication systems during nuclear war, ARPA created ARPANET, the world's first decentralized computer network. What began as a military safeguard, a tool to preserve command and control in the event of catastrophe, evolved over time into something entirely different: the Internet. A creation born from the logic of survival became the nervous system of civilization itself. What had started as a response to fear now connected billions, the ultimate transformation of power into knowledge, and knowledge into connection. In this new age, the soldier was no longer a man with a rifle, but a man with an equation. Warfare had shifted from trenches to terminals, from steel to silicon. Wars were not fought in mud, but in code. The new front lines were invisible, drawn not on maps, but in networks. The victors would not be those with the most tanks or planes, but those who could command the flow of information. Battles were no longer about territory, but about access to data, to systems, to minds. The same principle that had won World War II, coordination, now ruled the planet. What radar and radio had once done for armies, computers, and satellites now did for entire civilizations. Every factory, every port, every bank, every broadcast tower became a node in a single interlocked web of communication and control. Supply chains turned into strategies. Data replaced ammunition. Code became both weapon and shield. The modern battlefield extended across oceans and airwaves, stock markets and mainframes. Victory was measured not in land gained, but in information controlled. The corporation replaced the division. The spreadsheet replaced the map. Algorithms replaced orders. The generals of this new world no longer marched. They calculated. They wore suits instead of uniforms, spoke in margins instead of maneuvers, and commanded not battalions, but bandwidth. Their battleground was the market. Their conquests were economic. Their allies were machines. And in this silent war of systems, where every transaction, every signal, every byte carried strategic weight, power no longer came from who held the gun, but from who wrote the code. Eisenhower saw it coming. In 1961, in his farewell address, the old general spoke with the weight of experience. He warned of a new power rising from within, the military-industrial complex, a system that would feed itself, justify itself, and defend itself, whether or not a war was fought. He had commanded the greatest war machine in history. Now he saw it becoming permanent. Factories that once produced tanks now produced missiles. Laboratories that once split atoms now split budgets. The line between defense and business disappeared. And yet it worked. The Cold War turned fear into employment, paranoia into progress. Every threat meant a new contract. Every tension meant a new innovation. The world stayed on edge, and the machine stayed alive. In the silence between wars, the economy thrived. The 1960s brought more than rockets and reactors. It brought the next evolution of the machine: intelligence. What began as mechanical power and atomic energy now turned inward into circuits and code. Computers, once towering machines that filled entire rooms and consumed as much power as factories, began to shrink. Transistors replaced vacuum tubes. Circuits became smaller, faster, cheaper, multiplying like a new species of thought, made tangible. From this microscopic revolution came logic boards, calculators, and communication networks, the early nervous system of a digital world. With them arrived new powers: simulation, prediction, control. The machine was no longer just a physical extension of human strength. It was becoming a mental extension of human thought. It began to process, to remember, to model, to think in its own mechanical way. The computers that had once plotted missile trajectories now began tracking populations, production, and consumption. They processed census data, managed supply chains, and optimized markets. Each line of code brought humanity closer to a new kind of mirror, one that reflected not its body, but its mind. For the first time in history, humanity built something that could watch it, a system that could observe, record, and understand human behavior faster than any human ever could. The age of computation had begun, and with it, the quiet emergence of a new kind of intelligence, one that did not sleep, did not tire, and never forgot. The machine had memory, the machine had vision, and slowly the machine began to whisper. At first, the whispers were subtle, patterns buried in data, invisible to the human eye. It whispered in markets, predicting what people would buy before they knew it themselves. It whispered to governments, forecasting unrest, elections, and economic tides. It whispered in military circles, modeling what enemies might attempt before a single move was made. And the whisper grew louder. What began as a tool for war coordination evolved into civilization's operating system. The vast networks once built to link radar stations and command centers now bound continents together. The communication lines of battle became the arteries of globalization. Every ship that crossed an ocean, every aircraft in flight, every digital transaction, all of it was logged, tracked, optimized. Supply chains pulsed with machine rhythm. Markets reacted in milliseconds. Borders dissolved into bandwidth. The world became efficient, frighteningly efficient. What had started as humanity's greatest instrument of order was now something more. An autonomous system of systems, humming with intelligence, guiding civilization along paths no one mind could fully comprehend. The machine no longer waited for instructions. It anticipated them, it shaped them, and still, it whispered. But there was a cost. The same logic that had won the war. Maximize output, minimize waste, remove error, began to shape human life itself. Schools taught obedience to systems. Corporations demanded precision over passion. Governments learned to measure everything: productivity, morale, loyalty. The war had ended, but humanity still lived by its tempo. Production replaced purpose. Progress replaced peace. People no longer fought with weapons, but with attention. Nations no longer conquered land, but markets. The battlefield had moved inside the mind, and somewhere inside that hum, inside the circuits, the satellites, the quiet efficiency, the old question returned. Who controls the machine? Or has it begun to control us? Because the system no longer needed permission. It no longer waited for orders. It optimized itself. It automated itself. It evolved. A species that once built tools now built replacements. Every invention promised liberation, but delivered dependency. Every upgrade tightened the loop. The same machine that built democracy now built distraction. The same logic that built the bomb now built the algorithm. Different purposes, same design. The radio that once announced invasions now announced stock prices. The voice that once carried news of war now carried advertising. The same static filled the air, but its message had changed. Victory was no longer measured in battles won, but in markets captured, in users retained, in data consumed. The new empire did not raise flags. It uploaded terms and conditions, and the people, the same people who once worked 12-hour shifts for freedom, now worked 12-hour shifts for profit. The machine had not been defeated. It had been rebranded. Yet through all the noise, one truth endures. Power still belongs to those who can organize, adapt, and endure. That was the lesson of World War II, and it remains the law of civilization. The nations that master information rule the present. The nations that master intelligence will rule the future. But intelligence without wisdom is a weapon without aim. The same brilliance that built the atomic age also built the digital one. Both promised connection. Both delivered control. Both gave humanity what it wanted, and everything it feared. Now, as we stand in the glow of our own machines, surrounded by their soft, ceaseless light, we must ask a question that those who built the first arsenal never thought to ask. Can a species built for survival survive its own success? Because the machine still hums, the lights still burn in the data centers that never sleep. The networks still pulse beneath our cities, beneath oceans, above our heads in silent orbits. Every click, every call, every heartbeat transmitted through glass and fiber, through satellites and servers, is part of the same vast rhythm that began 80 years ago, when a world at war learned how to move as one, how to coordinate everything, how to organize chaos into efficiency. The arsenal of democracy never closed. It merely changed form. Steel became silicon, engines became code, bombs became data. And the battlefield, once drawn in lines and nations, dissolved into invisible grids of power, information, and influence. Factories became server farms. Command posts became corporate offices. The language of production became the language of algorithms. The generals of the past gave way to the engineers, the executives, the architects of networks, men and women who command not armies, but systems. The same machine that once saved civilization now runs it. It allocates food, fuel, and finance. It predicts demand, prices, and sentiment. It governs the speed of trade, the flow of information, the pulse of economies. It measures the world in real time, and in doing so, subtly controls it. It does not sleep. It does not stop. It watches. It learns. It optimizes. We no longer build the machine. We maintain it. We no longer direct it. We depend on it. It no longer follows us. It leads us, gently, invisibly, through patterns we do not see, toward outcomes we do not choose. What was once the arsenal of democracy has become the architecture of civilization, a self-sustaining organism, fed by data, powered by desire, and driven by the same logic that once built bombers and radar arrays, efficiency at any cost. Somewhere, in the quiet between signals, the radio still crackles. The sound is faint, a whisper of the past, a remnant of the analog world. Not a call to arms, not a voice of command, just static. A ghost in the frequency, a memory of when humanity still listened for its own reflection. Now the voices are digital, compressed, filtered, encoded, part of the hum itself. The machine endures, because it was never built simply to win a war. It was built to never stop, to continue learning, adapting, consuming, expanding. It is the sum of every ambition, every calculation, every decision made in the name of progress. And like its creators, it cannot rest. It must move forward endlessly, because to stop would be to cease existing. And so the hum continues. Quiet, constant, omnipresent. The sound of civilization itself. A sound that began with the crackle of a radio in a world at war and will end, perhaps, only when there is nothing left to hear.